years ago, my husband and I were traveling across America doing the missionary thing, and we were in a hotel. I think we were in Texas, and we were waiting for the evening service to start and just watching TV, reading books, just waiting. And I went over and I opened the curtains in the hotel room and I looked out. We were up about the third or fourth floor, so I got a good view. And out in front of the window was a telephone line or some type of a wire. And as I looked at it, it was a little bit in the distance. There was like a clump on this line, and I kept thinking, what is that? And then I began to notice this bird kept flying by this clump and calling to it or making noises at it. And I just sat there watching. And pretty soon I saw some little tiny feet, and eventually the little feet all separated out, and there were like 6 or 8 baby birds on this line, and this mother bird was calling to them to fly, to take their first flight. And they were hanging on for dear life. The wind was causing the line to sway, and these little birds had their little claws, wrapped as tight as they could around that line. They weren't going anywhere, no matter how much mother called and called for the first little brave bird to take the plunge. And I thought to myself, they were really afraid. Poor little guys. I felt sorry for them, but thought, how did they get there? They had to come from a nest up higher. They had to either fly to the line or they fell to the line, but somehow they got there, and they were not going to leave that safety that they had found in that line. Well, we watched for about 45 minutes, and they never did fly. We had to go on. When we came back later, they had flown, thankfully, or they'd fallen, or whatever. They were not there anymore. But I've often thought about those little birds and remember watching them and waiting to see what they would do. They were scared to death, but anyway, they flew. And they had to, didn't they? They had to fly. And we can be like those little birds. We can get our claws wrapped around something, and we don't want to leave it. We don't dare let go, because maybe we don't want to fall again. We got to that place and we want to stay there, and we're hanging on to what we think is safe. But God, just like that mother bird, calls us to follow him, doesn't he? He calls us to take those steps of faith, to take that plunge, and to trust him a little further. That wire is not going to be the safest place for those little birds in the long run. If they're going to survive, they must fly. And we are the same way. We can be desperately hanging on to something that God knows is really not the best place for us to be. He knows it's not going to produce good in our life. He knows he has more for us. So he calls us to trust him and to learn to fly by faith. I thought of a few of the things that we hang on to, and so I'm going to talk through a few of these things. But I think you in your own life will know what it is that you hang on to, what it is that you refuse to let go of. And so we'll just talk through these things, and if you have some, let the Lord speak to your heart. The first thing I thought of is sadly, many of us hold on to resentment, don't we? We've been hurt. We've been wounded in some way. We've lost trust, and so we hang on to that resentment. We've been let down, and we just refuse to let go of it. And I wonder, why is that? Maybe, strangely, hanging on to it makes us feel justified somehow, or we get to where we like soothing ourselves with sympathy that we are a victim, and so we hang on to that. But what's going to happen if we hang on to that line? Really, we're going to get bitter, aren't we? We're going to get bitterness growing in our heart. And if we continue to harbor that resentment, it's going to do damage. But what does our Father call us to do? He calls us to fly, doesn't he? To fly into forgiveness. That's what he wants us to do, to forgive. And when we do, then we will find the peace in our heart, and we will be able to offer peace to those around us. Another thing we hang on to is prejudice. And prejudice can take many forms. It's not just about black and white, okay? It's an attitude. It's an attitude of judging. It's an attitude of presuming. And it's an attitude of fear. We're afraid. Prejudice means we're afraid because we don't have the knowledge about the other person or the situation. So we make up our mind. We feel safer with our like kind. We feel safer with the unwritten rules of our group because we know how to work inside that. But it causes us to miss out on so much that God has for us. He created so much variety, didn't he? So much variety. We see it in nature and in animals and landscapes. And God said it was all perfect. It was all beautiful. And He loved it. And it all brings Him glory. So we need to let go of our prejudices and fly into love and acceptance of what God created. And when we do, we will be flying into the freedom to care for other people, to express His love to them, and to experience a wider view of God's creation and to expand our own world of knowledge. We also cling to pride, don't we? We cling to it, and we cling to it, and we cling to it, and the longer we do that, the smellier it gets. Pride stinks. You can smell it. It invades every part of a person's life, their speech, their attitudes, their actions, their decisions. Pride stinks. We need to let go of it big time. And we need to fly off into dignity and humility. Because you know what? We are not more worthy. We are not more valuable. We are not better than anyone else. God created all of us equal. He loves us equally. And I is in the middle of pride. Pride. Do you see it? And that's what pride is. It's about me, I, myself, no one else. I come first. But humility gives us the freedom of openness. It allows us to open our hearts and our lives to other people, to reach out to them with a sweet-smelling savor instead of a off-putting stink, because they will smell our pride. We must let go of this one before it pushes everyone else away from us. Another thing that we hang on to is ignorance. And I'm not talking about smarts or intellect. What I'm talking about is our refusal to think things through. Our refusal to take time to compare our thoughts with God's words, or to the choice that we make to shut out truth, or maybe even anything that would challenge us to change our mind or consider someone else's point of view. It's an ignorance that the Bible calls foolishness. And the book of Proverbs has a lot to say about foolishness. And we cling on to this idea because we fear change usually. And we think it's easier for us to not expose ourselves to other ways of thinking because we're stubbornly holding on to our own redneck ways, really. If we keep hold of this type of an attitude, then our world is going to get smaller and smaller, and we will get farther and farther away from the reality of what the world is like around us. We are better to trust in God's wisdom and fly off into His truth. And that will give us the confidence that we need to navigate the things that we don't understand. Without flying away from our stubborn ignorance, we're going to find ourselves clinging to our smallness, to our little tiny bubble where we live. We're going to begin to fear more about losing control. We're going to get more uncomfortable with change and difference. Or we will cling here because we think that ignorance and smallness means we have less responsibility. But that's not what God says, is it? He says we will all give account of ourselves unto Him. So we are better to fly off of this line. We need to have that increased vision. And God says He will put the world in our hearts. So we need to see the needs of others and not just our little bubble. We are supposed to be reaching out with the gospel, aren't we? And we cannot do that if we're clinging on to our smallness and our ignorance in these things. We need to be brave enough to fly into the freedom of influence and see that what God can do with one little bird that was not afraid to burst his bubble. The final thing I thought of that we hang on to is fear. And you know, really, actually, all of these things are based in fear, aren't they? We're afraid to forgive. We're afraid of differences that we don't understand. We're afraid of exposing ourselves, and that's really what pride is. It keeps us from opening ourselves to others. We're afraid of change. We're afraid to get out of our comfort zones. Fear, fear, fear permeates every part of our life. And I hear you saying to me, but Gail, I don't know what will happen if I get off that line. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know how far I'm going to fall before I learn to fly. And you know what? That's right, you don't. But God does. God does. He knows it, and He's still calling you to faith. Without faith, it is impossible to please Him, right? That's what he tells us. We need to live by faith. I'm sure those little birds thought the same thing that day as they clung to that line. But sometime in the afternoon, they did. They let go and they flew. And you know what? I really doubt that they had any regrets. And you will never regret flying by faith either. You will not be the same as you were once you take that plunge, that big plunge. But the joy of free flight is exhilarating because God is there. He's watching you on that little line too. He knows where you are, but he's calling you, just like that mother bird, to trust him further, to take the plunge. He has more for you than what you think is safety. He is your safety, and you won't know that until you get off that line you're clinging to and fall into the everlasting arms. His wonderful promises are there for you. They will be the air beneath your wings, so trust him. John Greenleaf Whittier wrote, "Nothing before, nothing behind, the steps of faith fall on the seeming void." I'm sure that's what those little birds felt like, and I know that's what we feel like when we take a huge step of faith. But here's the truth. You will find the rock beneath. Nothing before, nothing behind. The steps of faith fall on the seeming void and find the rock beneath. And you will find him there too. So let go of what you're hanging on to and trust the Lord. Learn to fly by faith.